all of that stuff just has really disturbed me over the last couple of days, and I've kind of been in this rabbit hole. I would really like to have your opinion, because I'm really having a hard time with this. And welcome to the Midlife Revolution. Thanks for being here, everybody, and thank you for your patience while I got everything settled outside of the closet. I think last Wednesday we left off the episode about my faith crisis a little sooner than I wanted to because of my technical difficulties. And so I wanted to finish the video that I started out with. I posted on TikTok a shortened version of my meltdown in the car where I was at a point where I had gotten so much information about some of the truth claims of the church that I didn't really know what to do. And then as I continued digging, I found some information that disturbed me. Well, here's what's interesting about it. It's information that I knew for a long time. This was nothing new to me. The difference is that when you are in the church and you are trying so hard to just live your life according to the teachings of the church, lots of times when problems come up, you sort of explain them away. And what the saying in the church was that you're supposed to just put them on the shelf. There was a famous talk that one of the women leaders gave when I was a teenager that said that just if there's something you don't understand or something that you are wrestling with or struggling with, and it's a question that can't be answered, just put it on the shelf. And then someday we'll know everything we need to know. You can ask God when you see him, or God will reveal it to the prophets, and you'll be fine. So that's why a lot of times when Mormons leave the church, they say, my shelf broke, because there were so many things on the shelf. I kept putting things on the shelf over and over, and finally my shelf broke. And this is what happened to me as well. I had a lot of things on my shelf, and the meltdown in the car was me taking things off the shelf and examining them and looking at them for the first time from the perspective of critical thinking rather than magical thinking, and trying to bring in facts where before there had just been feelings. And people will often comment when I talk about leaving the church that they will say, don't forget the feelings that you have, because the church teaches us to, when we feel that burning sensation, when we feel that burning in our heart, that warm feeling, that's supposed to be the Holy Ghost telling us that what we're hearing is true. And so we rely on those feelings rather than on facts, because the story of Joseph Smith is frankly unbelievable, that God and Jesus Christ appeared to him and told him that he was going to be a prophet. So if you think about that story just from a factual standpoint, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? You have to make a lot of room for conjecture. And what I have come to find is that the solution that requires the least amount of conjecture is likely the truest explanation for something. When I was in the church, I was told to just be faithful, just pray harder, just get a better witness, just keep believing. No matter what you do, just keep believing. And that allowed me to look beyond a lot of facts and a lot of logical explanations, because I was trying to be faithful and come at it from a faithful perspective. So I knew all about polygamy, or at least I thought I did growing up in the church. I knew that polygamy was a practice in the church. What I was told is that it was something we did a long time ago. The church officially disavowed it. It was a temporary thing. And then, when the church denounced it, we completely moved away from polygamy and we'll never have to do it again in this life. And then God will explain why he did that later. That's what I was taught as a child and as a youth growing up. As a young adult, I came to understand that a lot of people believed that it was Brigham Young who instituted the practice of polygamy after the saints went to the Utah Territory. Then facts started to come out that said that actually Joseph Smith did institute polygamy. Then we were told he had a few wives, but it was after the Revelation, section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants came out, which we're going to go over a whole timeline. And then that Emma knew about it and that she signed with the Revelation because it was explained to her from a faithful standpoint. So then so much information came out about Joseph Smith being the one who actually instituted polygamy that the church started having to make some concessions for the historical accuracy of those accounts. And there was a woman named Sandra Tanner who did a lot of research on not just polygamy, but church history in general, the Book of Mormon. And she really was is the pioneer of so much of this research, compiling the research, and she and her husband put out several books, pamphlets, essays, things like that, to help people have a true historical frame for Mormonism. So during this time of research, I had always known polygamy was a problem for me. It was an issue for me. And the idea that we don't practice it anymore really isn't true. Because when you get married in the temple, a man and a woman get married, let's say the wife dies. Well, the man can be eternally sealed to another woman. Let's say a man and woman get married and the man dies. The woman cannot be eternally sealed to another man. So at this current time, there are 2 leaders of the church who are sealed to multiple women. That's basically polygamy, except for the fact that their wives did pass away, but then they married another woman. They were sealed to them eternally. So what they believe, the top 2 leaders of the church, Russell Nelson and Dallin Oaks, what they believe is that they will have both of those women as wives in the afterlife. So to say that we don't practice polygamy anymore and it's not part of our faith is not really accurate. So during this time of questioning everything and taking everything off my shelf, I finally, after this car meltdown, decided that I was going to attack polygamy from the standpoint of I just have ignored and all of this stuff, and I've been told so many different things. I don't know what's true anymore, so I'm going to go find out the truth. And I came across a lecture that Sandra Tanner was giving to a group of other Christian leaders. It was talking about why Mormons leave the church. And I would like to share it with you. Technology.
How do you rationalize Joseph Smith approaching teenage girls and women that are married and have living husbands and telling them they have to go into polygamy? And by the way, be sure you don't mention this to my wife. And the Mormon scholars all know this. This is not a historical thing that they challenge. They just have to, well, this fellow I had dinner with, I said to him, how do you avoid the conclusion that Joseph Smith was a sexual predator? And he says, whoa, that's pretty strong. And I said, but how do you avoid that conclusion? If you look at the story, it seems obvious that that's what you have. And he says, well, I believe he was sincere. He thought he was following God kind of thing. And I said, well, David Koresh was probably sincere. And you could name all the polygamists are sincere. There's all kind of people out there that are sincere. But that doesn't mean they may not be promoting something that's very, very wrong.
Sandra Tanner refer to Joseph Smith as a sexual predator, it really caught my attention because I am a survivor um, of multiple types of assaults and abuse. And it was the first time that the cognitive dissonance of my survivor brain and my Mormon brain started fighting with each other. Because during my trauma healing and my recovery, I finally learned the words that I needed to describe what happened to me. I learned what a predator was. I learned what grooming was. I learned how manipulation and control happens. And to hear Sandra Tanner refer to Joseph Smith as a predator blew my mind because I didn't think that that was the case. I thought that all of his wives had given consent, and I thought that they had all agreed to do this. And I knew the apologetic argument that some of his wives were just spiritual wives. They were not, they were sealings for eternity only, that he didn't live with any of them, that there was no offspring produced from any of these. And so all of these like conflicting ideas were just swimming around in my head, and I was trying to make sense of them. So I decided to go look at some source documents, and what I really wanted was the firsthand accounts of these women. Now, I am not prepared to give a comprehensive explanation of polygamy, so this is not intended to be a just a definitive the last word on polygamy, comprehensive. It would take such a long time to dig into all of that, that I really just wanted to give sort of an overview of the things that I think people misunderstand the most, and the things that I didn't know, which when I discovered them finally became the last straw for me. So after hearing just this snippet from Sandra Tanner, I didn't even listen to the rest of the lecture because my mind was so blown. I was like, I am immediately going down a rabbit hole to look for source documents. So that's what I did. And I think it would be helpful to just for you guys to go over just a brief timeline of polygamy in Joseph Smith's era. So that is what I would like to do. The church was founded in 1830. So this is the timeline of how this all happened, okay? In 1820 was the first time that Joseph Smith wrote down about having a vision of God in Jesus Christ, but this all comes after that. So in 1823, that's when, and I'm going to put all this in quotes because this is what the claim is, right? I'm not presenting this as fact. Moroni appears to Joseph Smith and quotes prophecies about restoring the sealing keys as part of the priesthood. In 1827, he marries Emma Hale, his first and only legal wife. In 1829, he translates the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Jacob, in the Book of Mormon, there's some allusions to like when polygamy is authorized by God. I'm not going to dig into all of that right now. That's a rabbit hole for another time. And then in June 1830 is when the church was restored. And that was when Joseph Smith started revising the Bible. And the reason why these things are important to note is because this to me shows that it was a very methodical, planned out strategy by Joseph Smith to little by little introduce the idea of multiple wives and polygamy. If we look at it from the standpoint of, I think, all of these predatory situations, people who lead high control groups are in it for three things. And I learned this during my cousin Lori's trial. It really sums up so much of why people do anything: money, power, and sex. And if you think about it, Joseph Smith already had the power because he had lots of followers at this point. He was starting to get a lot of money because people were making sure that he and his family were well cared for. his home in Nauvoo, Illinois was referred to as the Mansion House. It was a very big house for the time. And if you've ever been to Nauvoo and seen like the other little houses, Joseph Smith's was much bigger. He had plenty. And so this was kind of the third rung to that stool, right? That he wanted to find a way to have access to women. So this timeline, I think, shows a very methodical lead up to being able to introduce that legitimately, because he could have done it secretly, but I think what he really wanted was for everyone to be on board with it and for him to be able to get exactly what he wanted. So in 1831, Joseph Smith receives a revelation affirming that marriage is ordained of God, and then starts talking about the idea of plural marriage. In July of that year, he reportedly receives a revelation informing a group of elders, these are basically just leaders of the church in Missouri, that they should take plural wives among the Native Americans. That's, again, a rabbit hole for another time. A very problematic part of Mormon history is that they believed that they needed to help to tame the natives, quote unquote, these are their words, and to turn them into a fair and delightsome people. There are parts of the Book of Mormon that talk about white skin being white and delightsome and black skin being a curse. And the Mormons believed at that time that if they took Indian women to wife and had children with them, that the children would gradually become whiter and whiter, and that would make them more and more righteous. If you've never heard this before, it is very shocking, horrible part of Mormon history that, again, not a lot of LDS people like to think about or talk about, but it's there. And again, it's a rabbit hole for another time that we will dig into. So that was kind of the first mention of polygamy, was having elders or leaders in the church take Native Americans as wives. Then in 1832, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon were tarred and feathered by a mob in Hiram, Ohio. 50 years later, a source alleges that it was in retaliation for an intimate relationship Joseph had with a young woman and his future plural wife named Marinda Nancy Johnson. Now, as a child and a young adult, I was always taught that the reason why Joseph and Sidney suffered this horrible tar and feathering was because people didn't like Mormons, and people didn't like the fact that Joseph Smith talked about seeing God and Jesus Christ. That's what I was taught as a child. Digging into the history, we find out that there was among the mob a physician who they had brought along, the mob had brought along, because they had asked him to castrate Joseph Smith. Because the reason they were attacking him was because of this terrible affair that he had had with a young woman. That's the part of the history that I never got taught. Now, lucky for Joseph, the doctor decided at the last minute not to go through with it, that he couldn't stomach it. But just knowing that he was there and the reason for him being there corroborates this idea that he was being tarred and feathered, not because he was being persecuted for his faith, but because he had been caught doing inappropriate things with young women. According to Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, who had a lot of journal writings about this time period, and others, an angel with a drawn sword appears to Joseph Smith for the first of 3 times between 1834 and 1842, commanding him to practice plural marriage. Isn't that convenient that an angel threatens him with death if he doesn't start marrying plural wives? So Joseph's first plural wife was Fanny Alger, sometime between 1833 and 1835. I want to go quickly to a biography of Fanny Alger. There we go. So this, and I also want to share with you the sources that I'm using here. This website is called josephsmithspolygamy.org, and it is a faithful website. This website was created and maintained by a couple who are very well versed in church history, and they wanted to create a website that would help people frame polygamy in the right way so that you could understand the truth of the history of polygamy, but remain faithful. So everything that they have posted here is done so under fair use because they don't make any money from running this website. I highly recommend you going to it because I think that if you objectively look at all of the facts, that you, even though they're writing this from a faithful perspective, I think the conclusions that I came to, the conclusions that one would come to, even reading the faithful perspective of it, makes it really impossible to ignore that the way that this was done was very predatory in nature. And I will also say that I get a ton of comments like this one, Thomas123. Thanks for being here. Not sad why, or sorry, not sad, not sure why you would want to listen to someone talk about why they left the church if you are unhappy about it. But I get this, it's so sad that you traded your exaltation for leaving. Well, obviously that's not the way that I see it. The way that I see it is that I stopped listening to apologetics and started researching facts. And so the way that I see it is that I traded magical thinking for critical thinking, and I would rather know the truth. Some people do not want to know the truth, and that's okay. Some people want to remain in Mormonism blissfully ignorant, and that is okay. I think religion is necessary for a lot of people, and I'm not ever trying to cause anyone else to leave the church. What I like to do is make sure that people have informed consent. So if people do want to know the truth and they learn the truth and then continue to stay, that is perfectly fine. My faith crisis was the hardest thing I've ever been through, and considering what I've been through, that is saying a lot. I would not wish that on my worst enemy. I wouldn't want anybody to have to go through a faith crisis. But being a truth teller, I do not want to stay silent about my experiences, and this is my experience. So I do get a lot of people telling me, how sad it is to see where I am and how sad it is that I chose to be led astray and things like that. Those comments don't really bother me because they're not about me. They're about the person making the comment. The hard thing is when people leave the church, they become a mirror for people who stay. When someone sees a person leave the church, it forces them to examine their own shelf items and their own cognitive dissonance. And it makes us feel shame that if the person speaking is correct, it means that what I have believed for a long time is false. And it means confronting some really difficult truths. So I appreciate anybody who's here, whether you're faithful Mormon or not. If you're here listening, I appreciate you being here. And if you hear something that offends you, ask yourself why it offends you. Does it offend you because you think it's a lie? Or does it offend you because if it's true, it means that threatens your worldview? It was really, really hard for me to admit that I had been duped and lied to. That was the hardest part of it for me because I considered myself to be an intelligent human being. And not only was I duped and lied to, but then I perpetuated it by teaching it to my children. And that was really hard for me to wrestle with as well. Thank you guys for all of your kind and respectful chats. I really, really appreciate that. Margie, thank you for your support. This is really kind of you. Sorry, I have been somewhat ignoring the chat because I'm trying to make sure that I stay on track mentally. My brain has been scattered today. This is an interesting comment. At the time of the Bible, multiple wives was common. It wasn't common, but it was done. Mostly in the Bible, they refer to it as concubines, and things like that. So it's a rabbit hole for another time. I'm not prepared to have that discussion today, but it's one that I commonly get, and it's one that's worth talking about. So thank you for making that comment. Thank you so much to all of you who are here. I really appreciate you being here with me and helping me dig through all of this. So I want to go back to the josephsmithspolygamy.org. There is it's a very comprehensive site. It covers polygamy very well. There are some things I disagree with on the site. However, what I love is that they have biographies of all of Joseph's plural wives, and they very extensively cover the feelings of the wives, which is why I really like this. It's very comprehensive. So Fanny Alger was Joseph Smith's first plural wife. And so Benjamin F. Johnson, a close friend of Joseph Smith, beginning in the Kirtland period, recalled the circumstances in 1903. So they're clarifying that Benjamin F. Johnson said this in 1903 regarding that time. And this is what we call a late account, meaning in 1835, he didn't immediately write it down. This is him looking back on it. So he says, now as to your question, how early did the prophet Joseph practice polygamy? In 1835 at Kirtland, I learned from my sister's husband, Lyman R. Sherman, who was close to the prophet and received it from him, that the ancient order of plural marriage was again to be practiced by the church. This at the time did not impress my mind deeply, although there lived then with his family, the prophet's family, a neighbor's daughter, Fanny Alger. So Fanny was living in the home of the prophet, and I believe she was helping Emma keep house. He says, a very nice and comely young woman about my own age, toward whom not only myself, but everyone seemed partial for the amiability of her character, and it was whispered even then that Joseph loved her. The reason I think it's important to talk about this particular account is because if we frame it, sorry, I didn't show that to you as I was reading it. If we frame it that way, and if we look at it from the perspective that Sandra Tanner just gave us, that he was a predator, it makes a lot of sense that someone who has narcissistic tendencies and who wants power and control would choose someone that everyone else wanted as his first wife. Because then that means if Joseph has her, then no one else can. Just my 2 cents on that particular topic. According to Mosiah Hancock, writing in 1896, Joseph did not approach Fanny directly. Rather, he enlisted Levi Hancock, the brother-in-law of Fanny's father. So this would have been Fanny's uncle, to serve as intermediary. Levi first approached Samuel Alger, Fanny's father. Samuel, the prophet Joseph loves your daughter Fanny and wishes her for a wife. What say you? Uncle Sam says, go and talk to the old woman, Levi's sister, Fanny's mother, about it. 'Twill be as she says. Father goes to his sister and says, Clarisse, brother Joseph, the prophet of the Most High God, loves Fanny and wishes her for a wife. What say you? Said she, go and talk to Fanny. It'll be all right with me. Father goes to Fanny and said, Fanny, brother Joseph the prophet loves you and wishes you for a wife. Will you be his wife? I will, Levi, said she. Father takes Fanny to Joseph and said, Brother Joseph, I've been successful in my mission. Father gave her to Joseph, repeating the ceremony as Joseph repeated to him. So this is sort of a roundabout way for Joseph to get permission from Fanny's family. Skipping on down a little, it says things didn't go well for Joseph and Fanny. In 1872, a letter from William McClellan to Joseph Smith III. McClellan recalls details of an 1847 conversation with Emma Smith, where Emma acknowledged that in the spring of 1836, she missed Joseph and Fanny Alger, meaning she didn't know where they were. She went to the barn and saw him and Fanny in the barn together alone, which would have been very, very unusual for this day. She looked through a crack and saw the transaction. She told me this story, too, was verily true. What Emma witnessed is not specified, whether it was the plural marriage ceremony, an exchange of affection, or even sexual relations, we are not told. Regardless, it is obvious Emma did not believe the ceremony was valid and concluded the relationship was adulterous. Oliver Cowdery, who Joseph summoned to diffuse the situation, sided with Emma, discounting the validity of the polygamous marriage and later referring to it as a, quote, dirty, nasty, filthy scrape. Now, if you go and you look up what the word scrape meant in that time, it was, quote unquote, a low word. So there are a lot of apologists who say, well, we don't have any proof that Joseph did anything inappropriate with Fanny. And later, Oliver Cowdery was excommunicated. So he wasn't faithful. So we can't trust anything that he said. Well, why do you think he was excommunicated? One of the reasons listed for his excommunication was disloyalty to the prophet. So it could be that Oliver was talking about this affair with Fanny Alger, and the prophet did not want him talking about it, so he excommunicated him, because in the Mormon Church, excommunication immediately means a loss of credibility. And even now, people who leave the church have no credibility with people who are in the church because we've left, so we're not loyal anymore. We're not listening. And people will say, "Oh, if you have apostatized, meaning like you've left the church, right? You're speaking out against the church and its leaders, then you've lost the Holy Ghost and you've lost the ability to have truth spoken to you by God. So nothing you say counts. Nothing you say can be true." So, Kelly Kells, this is an interesting question and one that I hope to get to towards the end of wrapping everything up. It's a big question and not one that I can answer well in a short little soundbite, but I'm going to star your comments so I remind myself to come back to it. So I apologize for not being able to answer it right here in the moment. Oliver's vitriol may have been intensified due to his frustrations from recent leadership changes that diminished his overall importance. And I believe that his importance was diminished because he was threatening to expose the truth about Joseph's polygamy. So as a consequence of this, Emma coming in and finding Joseph and guys, I'm sorry, Fanny together, Emma immediately turned Fanny out of the house. Subsequently, both women were severely traumatized and Oliver Cowdery alienated. In addition, rumors of adultery quietly spread among the saints, although they were never loud enough to reach the local media. The first mention of the relationship in any known manuscript occurred in January of 1838. So anyway, this was Joseph's first experience with having a plural wife. I want to go back to the timeline here for a second. So that was between 1833 and 1835. We don't have the exact dates. And then summer of 1835, the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants is published. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the Doctrine and Covenants is a book of scripture that was published as a collection of Joseph Smith's revelations. And what's interesting to me looking at it now is that, especially in the beginning of the Doctrine and Covenants, it appears that Joseph is using this connection with God to pray to God about very specific things and then get very specific answers about what other people are supposed to be doing. And from time to time, there are things that Joseph is supposed to be doing, but there also are instructions to his wife and to the other people that Joseph has appointed as leaders of the church. So it would be very easy for someone who is just manipulating people to say, okay, I'm going to take this to God, I'm going to pray to God about it, and then God is going to tell me something, but it's obviously going to be whatever I want that thing to be. This is why I think the idea of I speak directly to God is really dangerous, because people who are unscrupulous can very easily use that to manipulate people. This is also called spiritual abuse. I'm telling you that God told me that you're supposed to do this thing, and if you don't do it, there are going to be consequences for you. Not only right now in the here and now of you're not going to get to retain your leadership position, but also in the future, in the afterlife, eternal consequences for your soul. And if you sincerely believe that this person is a prophet of God, then you do sincerely believe that your eternal salvation is in danger if you don't do what they say, which is why I have a problem with Joseph approaching young women and telling them, God told me that you're supposed to be my wife. I really just want to put that out there for people to understand that that's what Joseph did. So, um, going back to the timeline. So the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants was published. This includes the section 132, which is the section that talks about plural marriage. Then in 1836, Elijah, the prophet from the Bible, appears in the Kirtland Temple and bestows sealing keys upon Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, which, going back to a comment that someone made, I wonder if they were dabbling in psychedelics, because that's what I always think, like when there was a second person involved in some of these visions and things like that, it makes me wonder how Joseph accomplished getting someone else on board with that. Although in some instances we know that the other quote unquote witness was either not in the same room or not in the same proximity, or that they saw, for example, the golden plates underneath a sheet and didn't actually see the plates themselves. So there's a lot of strangeness around witnesses that saw and experienced the same things as Joseph. In 1840, Joseph started teaching others about plural marriage in private and made vague public hints at it eventually becoming a practice. So I see this as him really laying down the groundwork and the foundation for this over the course of several years. And just so that the whole community would be on board with it. I also just want to mention this site is called mormonr.org. I don't have time to go into everything about this site, but I believe it to be a reliable resource. If anyone knows differently, I'd love to be informed of that. But I wanted to just make sure that I share the sources that I'm using here. So in 1841, then Joseph Smith is sealed to Louisa Beeman. This is the first wife in Nauvoo. And then later, a couple months later, he starts introducing plural marriage to the members of the Quorum of the 12. This is the greater leadership of the church, including Brigham Young, John Taylor, and Heber C. Kimball. Brigham Young and John Taylor would later become presidents of the church. And then in 1841, Joseph is sealed to Zina Huntington, the first of about a dozen women who had legal husbands at the time of their sealing to Joseph. So just so that you know, Joseph was sealed to women who were already married. Joseph was sealed to other young women. He was sealed to old women. He was, he had over 30 wives by the time that we get through with it. They have a chart here on this site, and let me share it with you, that I think is really interesting to look at, because I'm a visual person, and so this really puts it into perspective for me. By the way, I do give to Wikipedia because I do use them from time to time for things, but I always try to check what's on Wikipedia with another source, and I look at the footnotes very carefully when I'm doing this kind of digging. So this chart, I don't know how well you can see it on the small YouTube screen, but this tells you women who were also married to another man are in a red square, or red. They're designated with the color red. Blue means they were previously married. Green means they were single at the time. A circle means the marriage date is known, and a diamond means the marriage date is estimated. On the right side over here, it shows the age gap between Joseph and the woman that he was marrying. And then the age of the women at the time of marrying Joseph. So the oldest woman was around 60, and the youngest was 14. At the time that he married this 14-year-old girl, he was 37 years old. And we're going to talk about her in just a second. So this, to me, really puts a visual perspective on it. The fact that he had so many women that were already married to other men, and I believe 2 of them who were pregnant at the time that he married them. So I don't know. Hey, Backyard Professor, good to have you here. I appreciate you. Okay, I want to go back to the timeline just for a second and make sure that we cover this. Okay, so Zina Huntington is the first of a dozen women who had legal husbands at the time of their sealing. That was in 1841. Then Joseph receives a revelation from Miranda Nancy Hyde that may contain veiled instruction for her to accept plural marriage. Guys, go in here and look through all these footnotes. It is really fascinating to dig into it. It said, the revelation said this: "Let my handmaid Nancy Miranda Hyde hearken to the counsel of my servant Joseph in all things whatsoever he shall teach unto her, and it shall be a blessing upon her and upon her children after her." Miranda recalled that this revelation was given to her specifically in the context of Joseph Smith teaching her about plural marriage late in 1841. Then Joseph Smith purportedly writes a letter later referred to as the happiness letter to Nancy Rigdon, which reads as an argument for justifying plural marriage. Now, I want to point out that church leadership has quoted this happiness letter to basically say that the whole design of our existence is happiness. They quoted this letter for a long time while they were still denying that Joseph had practiced this type of polygamy, especially during the Nauvoo period. But let's go back and look at what the letter says, or at least part of it anyway. The text of this letter first appeared in the Sangamo Journal as purported copy of the original, forwarded by John C. Bennett, who was Joseph Smith's right-hand man for a very long time until he crossed Joseph and then he got excommunicated. Are you seeing a pattern? When anybody disagrees with Joseph Smith, they get excommunicated. It essentially says that whatever God commands is right, regardless of whether it appears logical or right to those who receive the commandment. I'm going to leave this up here on the screen for just 1 sec. Hi there, Latter Daily Digest. Good to see you as well. Thank you so much. I really want to go watch that episode that you have with Peter. I enjoyed his commentary during Nemo's excommunication episodes, and I love Nemo. I think he's amazing. I love it. Okay, so let's go back to the happiness letter. Some scholars question the authenticity of the letter because of the uncertain provenance of Bennett's reproduced version of the letter, as well as Bennett's unreliable allegations on other matters related to Joseph Smith. If the letter is authentic, then it could provide insight into Joseph's rationale for the moral basis of plural marriage, although plural marriage is never explicitly mentioned in the text. The actual happiness letter. Okay, here it is. Happiness is the object and design of our existence, and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it. And this path is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God. So that's the part that the church leaders like to quote all the time. B.H. Roberts, as editor of History of the Church, included the letter in a compilation with the following note: "It is not positively known what occasioned the writing of this essay, but when it is borne in mind that at this time the new law of marriage for the Church, marriage for eternity, including plurality of wives under some circumstances, was being introduced by the prophet, it's very likely that the article was written with a view of applying the principles here expounded to the conditions created by introducing said marriage system." So I would encourage you to look up, and I'll put in the show notes later, and read the happiness letter in its entirety, because I like to think of it in the context that the person receiving it would have received it. I think it's important always for us to consider, and that's the whole reason I started this perspective, is because I wanted to hear it from the perspective of the women. Did they feel like they were preyed upon? And what were the circumstances surrounding the alleged proposals and all of those things? So, B.H. Roberts is considered to be a faithful Mormon historian. He was appointed by the leadership of the church to be a historian. He did come across a lot of problems with the Book of Mormon, and he presented that to the church, and they sent him on a mission. So, okay, in May, well, actually, we should back up a little bit. In March of 1842, Joseph Smith became a Freemason. He joined the group of the Masons that were in the area at the time, where he would have learned a lot of Masonic ceremonies. And then 2 months later, he introduces the endowment ceremony for the first time, which, can anyone guess, very closely resembles the Masonic ceremonies. So there's that. Come to your own conclusion there. We'll talk about the temple ceremony in a different video. It is definitely a rabbit hole for another time. Then at the end of, well, just a couple weeks later, church leader and Nauvoo Mayor John C. Bennett is excommunicated for adultery, with a footnote. It was publicly announced in the Times and Seasons because I believe Joseph wanted everybody to know what was happening. The accusations of his adultery were chronicled by Andrew F. Smith, who did a biography on John C. Bennett, and it's a fascinating thing to dig into as well. If you look at it from the lens of, again, everything that I started researching at this point, I wanted to look at it from the lens of what conclusion requires the least amount of conjecture from me. It's the sort of principle of, does it make more sense that X, or does it make more sense that if Y, then possibly Z, and maybe a third option? The more I have to do what they call the mental gymnastics to make those square pegs fit into those round holes, the less likely it is for that thing to be the correct, true explanation of that thing. Also, going through trauma therapy and learning how to defend myself against manipulators and predators and liars helped me to frame all of this information in a much different light and look at it from a much different lens. Once you know that you've been manipulated and lied to, and you want to protect yourself from it, it's very difficult to remove that lens from your eyes and give people a pass for something. And what's interesting is, as a mother and as a teacher, I was very able to put that frame of mind on when I was hearing stories from my students about why they didn't do XYZ, or why they missed this assignment, or whatever. it was very easy for me to think critically in those situations and go, that's just not likely to be true. And to do the investigation that it takes to trust but verify when it came to my students. I had a wild story once my very first year teaching in the classroom where it was a requirement. I required my students to go to the concert. That was a grade for them. They had to perform. That was part of what they're supposed to be learning. I was a choir teacher. And they knew that if they missed the concert and they didn't have some kind of an emergency or an excuse of that kind, that they were going to get a failing grade. And so they would, of course, sometimes come up with silly explanations of why they weren't there. My very first year teaching, my very first concert, this girl did not come to the concert, and then she didn't come to class for several days. And when she did finally come to class, I said to her, "Why did you not come to the concert?" And she said, "Oh, my dad died." Just very matter of fact like that. And while I understand that different people grieve in different ways, of course, I was very suspicious of that. And I said, "I'm very sorry to hear that." And I just went on with class and finished class and everything. When I got to my conference period, I called her mother and I said, "I'm so sorry to hear about your loss." And the mother said, "What loss?" And I said, "Well, your daughter told me that her father passed away." And the mom was exasperated, to say the least. So it seems pretty obvious to most people that that would be a lie, although it's kind of a wild lie to make up just to not get a bad grade on a choir concert. But that's how I feel when I look now at some of these apologetics and explanations for polygamy in Mormonism. It's like we've been asked to explain away the most logical thing because we don't want to believe that Joseph Smith had poor character. So I'm sorry for the digression. I just wanted to explain my frame of mind as I was going through these things. Having been a faithful member for, 45-ish years, I think I mentioned that I started to be disaffected with the church in 2015, but I was still very, very faithful all the way up until just prior to my divorce, is when I stopped going to church every single Sunday and doing every single thing I was supposed to. And oddly enough, I didn't stop paying tithing until after the pandemic was over. So I considered myself to be a very faithful temple recommend holding Mormon. My recommend expired in 2018, but I was still worthy of a recommend for a very long time after that. I would have passed the interview except for the fact that I was questioning leaders. So there was that. I probably wouldn't have gotten a recommend at that point. Anyway, I digress again. Back to the timeline. I'm trying to stay on track. So in 1842, July, Joseph Smith is sealed to Sarah Whitney in the presence of her parents with her father, Newell K. Whitney, who also later was a polygamist, performing the ceremony using words that were given to him in a revelation from Joseph. Joseph Smith in 1842 handwrites a letter to Elizabeth and Newell K. Whitney and their daughter Sarah Ann, who was recently sealed to Joseph, asking them to visit him while he's in hiding from Missouri lawmen. So by the end of August 1842, Joseph is sealed to about a dozen plural wives, and then no additional plural marriages were performed for about the next 6 months. In October, the Times and Seasons published an official statement from the Nauvoo Relief Society condemning John C. Bennett and denying the existence of the secret wife system. So at this time, we were gonna have to skip over some of this stuff because there's just so much information. There are a couple of things that were particularly important to my personal experience digging into polygamy, and those are the things that I want to touch on. In May of 1843, Joseph Smith was sealed to his youngest wife, 14-year-old Helen Mar Kimball. And I want to go now to talk about Helen's own experiences from her own words, because this really, really struck me when I realized how young she was and I thought about her experience. So I'm gonna share this tab. So, um, Helen's parents joined the church, and Helen's father, Heber C. Kimball, was called as a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, so he was very high up and well respected in the church. She was baptized at age 8. And then she was introduced to the idea of polygamy at first by her father. I think what's really important to pay attention to is her very first reaction to this concept. So this is her own words. With all the false traditions in which we were born, and in consequence of the degenerate tide with which the human family has been drifting for generations past, and as the Lord had no organized priesthood on the earth, it is not to be wondered at that in our ignorance of his ways, the feelings of our nature should rebel against the doctrine of a plurality of wives. I remember how I felt, but which would be a difficult matter to describe, the various thoughts, fears, and temptations that flashed through my mind when the principle was first introduced to me by my father, who one morning the summer of 1843, without any preliminaries, asked me if I would believe him if he told me that it was right for married men to take other wives. Suffice it to say that the first impulse was anger, for I thought he had only said it to test my virtue. My sensibilities were painfully touched. I felt such a sense of personal injury, and displeasure, for to mention such a thing to me, I thought altogether unworthy of my father. And as quick as he spoke, I replied to him shortly and emphatically, no, I wouldn't. I had always been taught to believe it a heinous crime, improper and unnatural, and I indignantly resented it. So she goes on to talk about how her father was pleased with her reaction, but then also related to her that this had been told to him by the prophet of God, and that it does seem shocking, but it's okay. Again, a 14-year-old girl. We're talking about a freshman in high school. Sometimes, as you know, eighth graders are 14 years old. Somebody who has had very little experience in relationships with anyone outside of her own family and her own small community, and at a time when young people at this point relied so heavily on their parents and believed their parents so heavily, that to go against your parents in this time of history, in this period of history, at that age, would definitely have been outside of the normal. Then the next day, the prophet called at our house, and I sat with my father and mother and heard him teach the principle and explain it more fully. And I believed it, but I had no proofs, only his and my father's testimony. I thought that sufficient, and I didn't deem it necessary, and did not deem it necessary to seek for any further. Richard Anderson, who's a historian, observed, Helen says several times that her father took the initiative to arrange the marriage, and very possibly he did so with a view to committing her to the prophet before her budding social life produced a choice or a proposal from someone else. This made me really sick to my stomach when I read this the first time, and when I absorbed this idea for the first time. Because I will elaborate on this a little bit more, but looking at it from this perspective, and this is what it always bothers me when apologists will say, but there was no sexual relationship between Joseph and these young women. This was a spiritual sealing, which, first of all, it's pretty wild to claim that Joseph Smith taking on multiple wives had nothing to do with sex, because part of the revelation talks about multiplying and replenishing the earth, okay? And y'all, we can't do that without the sacred powers of procreation being involved, okay? So please don't try to tell me that there was no sex involved whatsoever. Then to try and say, and I honestly don't know which is worse. As a victim and a survivor, I don't know which is worse. Is it worse that Joseph violated a young woman? Or is it worse that he took their lives? When I say that, I mean he took their ability to have a normal life. Heber C. Kimball teaching his daughter the practice of plural marriage at a young age, before she had the chance to form an attachment with another young man that she might have fallen in love with, before she had another prospect or another proposal, is disgusting to me. He took their lives. Every single one of those young women had their lives severely altered because they would have been doing other things. They would have been enjoying normal life as young women. They would have been marrying men who had only them to devote their time and energy to. I want to read it to you from Helen's own words. She writes this beautiful poem, which I think you should go and read, but I'm not going to read it here for the sake of time. 1 year after writing this poem above, where she talks about her distress and the feelings that she had, it obviously, poetry can be interpreted in different ways, which is why I would like you to read it for yourself and come to your own conclusions. 1 year after writing this poem, she elaborates, during the winter of 1843, there were plenty of parties and balls. Some of the young gentlemen got up a series of dancing parties to be held at the mansion once a week. The mansion was Joseph Smith's home. I had to stay home, as my father had been warned by the prophet to keep his daughter away from there, because of the blacklegs and certain ones of questionable character who attended there. I felt quite sore over it, and thought it a very unkind act in father to allow my brother to go and enjoy the dance unrestrained with others of my companions, and fetter me down, for no girl loved dancing better than I did, and I really felt that it was too much to bear. It made the dull school still more dull, and like a wild bird I longed for the freedom that was denied me, and thought myself a much abused child, and that it was pardonable if I did murmur. I'm not going to apologize for being emotional, because it's a crime. This young girl, all she wanted was to have a normal, happy life. She wanted to go to dances. She wanted to hang out with her friends. Can you imagine a freshman in high school being denied the opportunity to socialize with her friends because secretly she's married to a 37-year-old man? And people like to say, oh, it was common back then for people to get married young, and young women married young men all the time. No, it was not common. It did happen from time to time, but it was not common. According to the 1830 census, which the 1840 data would not have been available yet at this time. According to the 1830 census, the average age for women to marry was 19. And when they did get married at 19, they were marrying other 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds, not 37-year-old men. And yes, I'm sure we all have an anecdotal instance of someone in our lives, some relative in the past who married young, married another person young. That doesn't mean it was common. It was not common. And also, Joseph Smith was the only one running around marrying multiple people at this time in history, right? And trying to justify it by saying that God told him that this is what was meant for them. After leaving the church, dissenter Catherine Lewis reported Helen as saying, "I would never have been sealed to Joseph had I known it was anything more than a ceremony." Assuming this statement was accurate, which is not certain, the question arises regarding her meaning of more than a ceremony. While sexuality is a possibility, a more likely interpretation is that the ceremony prevented her from associating with her friends as an unmarried teenager, causing her dramatic distress after the sealing. This is what needed to sink in for me, is that even if Joseph Smith was a prophet who was called of God, doing this kind of thing to young women, it's not something the God that I believed in would have been okay with. This was a pretty big straw for me. And there was one more account that I alluded to earlier that I would like to share with you. But when my parents and I had a conversation about me leaving the church and some of the reasons why, this was one of the things that I talked to them about because my youngest daughter right now is 14. At the time we had this conversation, she was 13. And I said to my dad, "What if it was my daughter?" Used her name. "What if the leader of some group came to her and said, 'God has told me XYZ.' What if it was the bishop of my ward that said, 'God has told me that polygamy is going to be reinstituted. The prophet has already said it's going to happen. And he's told all of the bishops to go choose a wife. And I choose you.'" What would you say to Felicia, my daughter, in that case? And, "Oh, well, that's, it's a different thing. It's not going to happen." Like all of the apologetic answers. And I'm sorry, but if you can't put yourself in those shoes and say, what would I do in this situation if it was my own child, if it was my own granddaughter, if it was my niece, any of those things, this is the way that predators operate. And I'm going to go back to Sandra Tanner for a moment because I did finally go back and listen to the rest of her lecture after I went down this little rabbit hole. And I want to share with you what finally solidified it in my mind. To put these two things together and to make it pretty absolute for me.
More on the dinner I had with this Mormon historian. One of the things that I asked him in our long conversation was, well, I have to tell you, this was when I was working on the newsletter that we just put out, Sacred Marriage or Secret Affair. And I'd just been working on all of that and going through all the stories of Joseph Smith's wives and was fairly appalled by the whole thing. And so I'm having dinner with this guy and I said, "How can you avoid the conclusion that Joseph Smith was a sexual predator?" And he said, "Well, that's, he was sincere." But I said, "Well, no, I don't think that's the way you get it. Because, for instance, in the newsletter, I tell about the case of Lucy Walker. Now, here's a young girl where she's in a family of 10 people, or 10 children. The family converts to Mormonism. They end up moving to Nauvoo. But the mother gets malaria in Nauvoo and dies, and then one of the children dies. So now we're down to 9 kids. And Joseph Smith's solution to this family's situation is to send the father on a 2-year mission to the East Coast, divide up the children into different homes, and take the teenagers into his home. So now he has this 16-year-old girl living in the home with her brother that's a year or so older than her. He starts privately going to the sister to try to convince her to become his plural wife. And she's praying about the whole thing. She doesn't know what to make out of it. Well, then it turns out that Joseph's wife, Emma, and the brother go on a shopping trip to St. Louis. And while they're gone, Joseph gets the girl to marry him. And she's just that date, the day before, turned 17, when she marries him in polygamy behind Emma's back. She later wrote in her own story of her life, what a devastating thing and how hard this was for her to do. She said, here I was without mother or father to consult, no one around to go to talk to, and yet being presented with this great issue. And of course, she prays and finally feels God spoke to her and told her to do this. And she goes into this plural marriage. But so I'm talking to this historian. I says, this shows a deliberate effort of isolating this girl from her family, from everyone around her, from any support system in a time of grief and loneliness. To put that kind of pressure on her is signs of a spiritual predator. I don't see how we can excuse this kind of behavior and say, well, he was sincere. You wouldn't give that kind of leeway to someone that approached your 16-year-old daughter. If your pastor came to you, to your 16-year-old daughter behind your back and proposed something like that to her, and you found out about it, you'd be so mad you'd try to kill a guy. So why does Joseph get a pass on these things? I don't understand how they keep saying it's okay. And if you read the story of the different wives, they all are horrible. Going to young teenage girls and saying God sent an angel with a drawn sword that was going to kill Joseph Smith. If he didn't go into polygamy, if she didn't marry him, God was going to kill him. And the struggle, the weight of responsibility this would put on a teenage girl, I'm going to be responsible for the prophet's death. Then he would also put the responsibility on these young girls that if you consent to this, it will ensure your parents' eternal salvation. They will have exaltation. How can a girl say, no, I'm not going to help my parents have eternal life? And so she finally submits to this. But to me, it clearly is the pattern of a sexual predator. But this fellow feels the Mormon Church does more good than harm, and we're here now, and that's where his family's at. And, of course, he's not living in Utah, so it's much, he's got a lot of non-Mormons around him. And so he doesn't feel the same pressure as you would if you were here locally. But we see this more and more with the scholars of this moving away from any truth claims, and everything becomes relative. Does it work for you? If it's working for you, stay there. If it's not working, then look for something else. And so our heart is that they come to see truth is important. What we do with our lives is important. The lies of Joseph Smith do affect people. They aren't just innocent things that don't touch other people. Because of Joseph Smith's polygamy, we have all the polygamists today. Mormons will say to me, but look at the fruits of Mormonism. I say, yeah, the fruits of Mormonism are 60,000 people living in polygamy today. That's the fruit of Joseph Smith. Those people wouldn't be in those situations had it not been for him privately going to teenage girls and coercing them into plural marriage. So is that?
So I don't think it gets a whole lot more clear than that, putting that into that perspective. And for those of you who are still having a hard time putting yourself in the position, of this particular situation. Take it away from religion for a second. Let's say that you are a middle-aged man and you have a wife and family, and you get a job at a corporation that is growing really fast. And let's say that the CEO of this corporation is really young, successful guy. And let's say tragically your wife dies, and the CEO of the corporation comes to you and says, you know, what you really need is a change of scenery. If you stay here, you know, near the corporation, you're going to just get so depressed that I think it's going to be terrible for your mental health. And I really think that you should relocate to a different area. I'm going to give you a job in our office that's 500 or 600 miles away from here. And I'll tell you what, because I think you need time to grieve and time to get, you know, into a better mental health place, I think you should go alone to that other location. And what I will do for you is I will take in your oldest children, your oldest sons and daughters, and I will call them my own. I'll treat them just like my own kids. I'll give them a place to live. They'll have everything that they need. You won't have to worry about them at all. You just go and heal. So, middle-aged man accepts the position, goes away on the transfer. His oldest kids go and live with the CEO. Then one day, the CEO's wife takes the oldest son of this man out of town on a trip. And while they're gone, the CEO goes and propositions the oldest of the daughters, who's 17. How would you feel as that middle-aged man when you come back from your assignment at another location working for this corporation and you find out that the CEO has been messing around with your teenage daughter? Would it matter the reason that he claimed to do it? Because that seems to be what a lot of the Mormon apologists say, is that they excuse this behavior of Joseph Smith because they say that the revelation came from God that he was supposed to do it. The reason wouldn't matter to me. It wouldn't. And you do sort of have to remove yourself for a moment from the religious perspective in order to really put this in the right place in your mind. Because when we believe that someone speaks for God, we do excuse all of their behavior. We say, well, there must have been a reason for it. You know, the God that I believed in would never have been speaking to a man like Joseph Smith. And the apologetics of, oh, you know, they would never let the prophet lead the church astray. It's just something that we tell ourselves because we can't believe their behavior was so terrible. And so we explain it away by saying there must be some other kind of explanation that God is good with. So again, we're adding conjecture upon conjecture upon conjecture to excuse terribly bad behavior because we want to believe that it really was God speaking to Joseph Smith, and not just that he wasn't a narcissist who decided to form his own religion so that he could have power and money and access to young women. This is how predators behave. They isolate their victims. They gather trust in the community. They appear one way in public and another way in private so that people don't question their authority, their judgment, their character, so that when people do start to make allegations, everybody questions the victim instead. Because we all say things like, oh, not Bill Cosby. He has such a great reputation. Oh, not Larry Nassar. He's a doctor. He would never abuse women. not this person who has such a great reputation in the community. That's why it takes 2 and 3 and 7 and 8 and 12 and 25 reports before someone finally listens to the victims instead of listening to the predator. We see this over and over and over again in our society. Victims get blamed and shamed when they're the ones who call out the predator. And I hear this all the time too. Oh, there's false reports all the time. Women always make false reports trying to ruin the reputation of a man. That is not true. The statistic that is correct, which is put out by an organization who researches these reports, says that between 6 and 10% of reports of sexual abuse or sexual assault, between 6 and 10% turn out to be false claims. When law enforcement is involved and the woman is reporting it or the man is reporting it to law enforcement, that number drops to 3%. So my challenge to you is to believe 97% of the victims. Believe the victims. And this is why I go off on a tangent, because in my case, my personal experience, one of my predators passed away before I even had the opportunity to think about filing a police report. It took me nearly 35 years before I felt like I deserved to speak up against this predator. Because of teachings in the church that teach us that if we put ourselves in a bad position, then what happens to us is our fault. One of my other predators, I will never be able to make a police report about. For various reasons, I won't get into the specifics. But just knowing the circumstances of what happened and who that person is and who I am, and knowing now, having been through the process of making reports, I will never be able to hold that person accountable for what they did to me. So it is not too far of a reach to say that Joseph Smith was a predator. And if that is true, which I believe it is, I believe the evidence clearly shows that he deliberately isolated his victims in order to get what he wanted from them. And that he kept it secret, he kept it private, only between the people that he really, really trusted for a very long time. And as you can see, he was successful at it. For a very long time, nobody talked about the fact that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. It was all blamed on Brigham Young. So if you believe, if you can frame it in the way that Joseph Smith was a predator, do you believe that he really spoke to God? Do you believe that God continued to speak to him after this happened? I was taught as a young woman that Joseph Smith was carted off to jail on trumped up charges and that he was martyred. In other words, he died for what he believed in. It wasn't until later that I found out that the reason he was in jail is because the Nauvoo Expositor, which was a newspaper that was printed specifically for the purpose of reporting on Joseph Smith's illicit activities with young women, and Joseph Smith, who was the mayor of the town at the time, ordered the printing press that printed that paper to be destroyed. And so he was sent to prison for that. So it was the only thing that pulled me out of my Mormon delusion, was listening to Sandra Tanner frame Joseph's behavior as predatory. And having been through that as a victim myself, it finally woke me up. It was literally the snap that brought me out of that delusion and allowed me to start framing everything else that I knew about the church and church history in the correct way, in the right light, to stop making excuses and conjecture for people and to start looking at the truth and the facts. And I think it's pretty obvious the reason why I continue to talk about it, because I believe in informed consent. I believe in people knowing what they're getting into. And I know, as I've discussed on my channel before, that the missionaries will not tell you these things when you're investigating Mormonism. And your seminary teacher will not tell you these things. And your Sunday school teacher will not tell you these things. Your bishop will not. Your Relief Society president will not. I just think it's important to speak the truth for anybody who is investigating the Mormon Church, or for anybody who's in the middle of a faith crisis. When you go to your bishop and say that you're having a faith crisis, he doesn't start pointing you to the gospel topic essays. He tells you to rely on the spiritual experiences that you've had, to have greater faith, to fast and to pray and to read your scriptures and to come to church every Sunday and just keep doing the faithful things. And eventually these doubts and these questions will go away. So I came to the conclusion, after all of this research, I think I went down this rabbit hole of reading the firsthand accounts of these women. And I think what did it for me too was that as a young woman, when I think I had just turned 19, and I got into a relationship with a much older man who told me that he was a much younger man. And I believed everything that he said. And if you read my diaries at the time that this relationship was occurring, it's just so clear that I wanted to believe everything he said. And so if you read it, you would think that's a consensual relationship between two adults. I was, 19, so I was over the age of majority. But ladies and gentlemen, children cannot give consent. Children under the age of 18 cannot give consent. And if their parents gave consent on behalf of the child, then they are complicit in their abuse. I hope that what I have said tonight has helped you look at some things in a new light, at the very least. Um, Trafficking is real. It really does happen. And I started speaking out the very first time that I started talking about my experiences as a survivor of trafficking was right around the time that I published my book about a year and a half-ish ago or so, and coincidentally, my book was released on the same day that the Sound of Freedom movie was released. And at the time, I already knew who Tim Ballard was, and I knew a lot of the allegations against him that you're just seeing now come out in the news, um, with multiple women filing lawsuits against him, claiming that he is a predator and claiming that he has abused and assaulted them. The pattern fits. Um, Now he has not been charged with a crime in a court of law. He's not been convicted. These lawsuits are pending. He has denied any wrongdoing, of course, but the pattern fits. And where did he learn it? He's been a Mormon his whole life until he was very publicly excommunicated, sorry, for the crime of allying himself with one of the leaders of the church and making the church look bad. It's a pattern. It's a pattern that was taught by Joseph Smith. And I think I said this on my episode last Wednesday as well, is that the church leaders always told us to stay in the boat. Just stay in the boat. I know you have doubts, it's okay. We're all in the boat together. We're all sailing to the promised land. If you just stay in the boat, you'll get there with us, and then all of this is going to be resolved and you'll be happy and it'll be fine. But what I found was that the boat was not in an ocean, it was just stuck on the same rock that it's been on since 1830, and when I climbed out of the boat, I found not a deep and scary ocean full of monsters, but a wonderful, wide world full of all kinds of possibilities, where I could start to consider the thoughts and feelings and ideas of non-Mormon people as valid, rather than dismissing it and saying, "Oh, you just don't know the truth. It's a pattern." Joseph Smith established a pattern. And when Sandra Tanner said that the Mormon historian, his response to her assertion that Joseph Smith was a predator, he didn't refute that Joseph Smith was a predator. The first thing out of his mouth was, "No, Joseph Smith was not a predator." What he said was Joseph Smith was sincere, meaning Joseph Smith sincerely believed that he was going to these young women on an errand from God. When that's your answer, rather than saying, "No, he wasn't a predator," then you know you can't make that claim. You know he was, because otherwise you would say that. Look at the fruits. Look at what he's done. Yes, exactly, as Sandra Tanner says, the fruits of his labor are 60,000 people stuck in polygamy, being abused and having their lives stolen from them. And when you have the current leadership of the church breaking the law, objectively, that's the truth, they broke the law. They were fined by the Securities and Exchange Commission because they didn't believe that they had to fill out those forms correctly. They didn't believe they had to answer those questions correctly. When asked how much they had in their fund, they said $1 million when they clearly knew that wasn't the case. That's a lie. It's a flat out lie. When I read about B.H. Roberts presenting to the entirety of the church leadership 141 typed pages with the problems with the historicity of the Book of Mormon and the anachronisms, for example, having horses and steel and silk and things that wouldn't have been here at that time, their response was not to refute the claims of B.H. Roberts. Their response was to stand up and bear their testimony and to say, "Well, I know it's true. I've had a personal witness. So whatever these problems are, they'll just go away because I know it's true." When you want to spot a liar or a manipulator, one of the best things that you can do is just listen to their response to your accusation or your allegation. If they don't immediately refute what you're saying, chances are that your accusation is accurate. When somebody says, you know, if I were to ask someone, when was the last time you watched pornography? And their response was to say, "That's an odd question. Why would you ask me that?" Then you know that they have, right? But for them to come back later and say, "I never have." Well, that wasn't your first response. So why would that have not been your first response? It's just interesting to listen to people with that filter that allows you to be clear-headed and logical about what makes the most sense. Yes, I believe this is true as well. Women were trafficked by the early missionaries from Europe. Missionaries were sent to Europe, and they were specifically, explicitly told by Brigham Young to bring back the pretty ones and not keep all the pretty ones for themselves. They were to be brought back into or brought into Mormonism in the Utah Territory, not knowing that polygamy was being practiced. And then once they got here, they didn't have a way to get back. They couldn't afford to go back. And so, yes, there is a very interesting episode on Mormon Stories about the trafficking of women with lots of evidence, receipts, and proof. And I would encourage you to look at that as well. I just want to finally, at the very end, address this last comment by Kelly Kells that I promised I would get back to. Do you believe anything now? I was raised Christian and not really sure if I believe in all what the Bible says because it was written by a man. I still have an unwavering belief in God in my gut. I just wanted to address this comment because have I've addressed this before, but I just want to give you some perspective. The short answer to this question is I don't know. I don't know anything for sure. And I actually really love that space because it allows me to explore, it allows me to wonder, it allows me to look at all kinds of different ideas and weigh them against my own experiences and against science and against all of the other things that are out there that it's possible to believe. But after this faith crisis, I think that I was able to really quickly deconstruct because I had already deconstructed so many things in my life by the time I got to this point in Mormonism. And this, by the way, was just in January of last year. So it hasn't yet been 2 years since I resigned from the church. And up until that point, I think I've shared that I was I was just in flux of, and I had gotten to this place where I just believed that Mormonism was true and I didn't fit in it. And the God that I believed in knew that I was faithful to him and knew how much work I had done for him faithfully and knew my heart and knew that I wanted my life to be acceptable to him. And knowing that and knowing that or believing that he loved me for who I was and not the version of me that fits in Mormonism, I had just come to the conclusion that Mormonism didn't work for me, and there's more than one path to God, and I don't know. I guess I'll figure it out. But having this crisis and being able to put away the possibility that Joseph Smith was actually a prophet of God opened my mind to so many possibilities. And the first thing that I did was I zoomed out and I looked at the area of the world in which the Bible was written. And I looked at what a tiny, small population of people that is in comparison to the whole world. And I thought, well, the Bible survived because there were people to pay to have it transcribed and to have it survive and to have versions of it continue to be passed down. Um, and when I think of that, I think of all the other faith traditions in the world that didn't have a written record of what they believed. It was passed down by oral tradition. And then I started to think about the tradition of religion in general. And the idea that I think the Native American idea of the Great Spirit and the idea of the Buddha and all of these other ideas about what or who God is. And so many religious traditions have more than one God, and so many religious traditions have a very different version of God than what's in the Bible. And I came to the conclusion that from the beginning of time, from the beginning of human existence, we, human beings, have had to create God to explain the things that we can't explain. For example, imagine as an early human being having an entire village wiped out by a tsunami. How do you explain that? Well, there must be somebody in the sky who controls the waves. And so I'm going to give offerings to that being in the sky so that the waves won't consume my village. And then if you fast forward that through time, my conclusion was that we human beings can never really know whether there's a God or what God is even like because we're humans. we have a limited minds. We cannot comprehend deity, really. So we have to do the best that we can if we want to use that as a tool for facing our existential fears of meaninglessness and of death and of the unknown. And my conjecture is that anytime human beings get involved with trying to explain the unexplainable, specifically deity, they're going to get it wrong because we're fallible human beings and everything that we produce has our footprint on it. We can't help it. Everything that I produce comes through the lens of my experiences. And so if I were to, write some kind of an idea of what I believe that God is, it's going to be flawed by my experiences, and it's not going to work for every person on the planet. And when I think of the idea, the arrogance of Mormonism to think that their way is the only way that you can possibly get to God and be saved in heaven, it's so arrogant. Because look at all of the different experiences that people have and the uniqueness of everyone's journey on this planet. There's no way that there's just one solution. So, and also just the idea that I think almost all the religions that have ever existed have been created by men, or at least the tradition has. There are a couple of religions that are based on women as gods and women as the storytellers and the keeper of the sacred traditions and things like that. But whether it's men or women is immaterial to me. It's human beings putting a very limited worldview onto something that is supposed to be expansive and eternal. I just don't think it's ever going to work. So the thing that I love and appreciate now is that I can explore lots of different ideas and I can become educated by lots of different people's ideas about God and religion. And there is something within me that wants to believe there's a God. There is, and I think that's a very human thing. But am I ever going to know, like I used to say as a Mormon, that I know? Absolutely not. I don't think I'm ever going to know. The other thing is that when I look at the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, I don't really like him. If that's really what God is like, is that a being that I would want to worship? One of I guess the beginning of my faith crisis started in 2008 because I was struggling as a young parent to find good examples of good parenting. And I decided that I was going to look at the Bible, and I started a blog called God is the Only Perfect Parent. And I wanted to look at the way God treats his children and then maybe model my parenting after that, because I didn't really have a good example of healthy parenting as a child. And I think I wrote 2 blog entries and then almost had a faith crisis right then and there, because I was like, this God is not a good parent. He's not loving towards his children. Like, even in the New Testament, he's not. It's like, either worship me or you're damned forever. I would prefer to believe in a God that gives room for the fact that people are going to have different experiences, and there might be a very good reason why they don't know you or don't want to worship you. And I think about my own parenting too. There was a time when one of my kids needed space from me. I think the God of the Old Testament would have probably struck them dead at that point, right? Like, I don't want to be near you right now. Oh, okay, well, that's it. You're cooked. So having to re-examine the concept of God, if there is a God, I hope that he is the type of God who is a loving parent, who does make room for the individual experiences of his children, who does care about suffering, who does care about trying to make the world a better place. If the president of the Corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is actually a prophet, where was he on September 11th? Where was he for all of these school shootings? Why are there children in their own church with food insecurity suffering? And that's the whirlpool that I get swirled down into because I can't fathom a divine being who wouldn't try to spare his children from unnecessary suffering. I think that sometimes our suffering can be a lesson for us, and I think that is part of our purpose in life is to experience suffering and yet be able to find joy in the ways that we live. If I do have a religion, that's it. It's to realize that joy comes in these tiny little moments that we have to learn to savor. Um, I think it's hard to think about a God that would allow their children to suffer needlessly because kids don't need to be hungry in order for them to learn the lessons of life. Kids don't need to be senselessly killed in order for them to learn to be a good person or learn how to live in this earth. It's just that's the ongoing question for me. What I love is engaging in discussions about different versions of spirituality for people, and for me, my spirituality is in nature. I have such a strong connection um, to the natural world, and water is something that I'm drawn to. I feel a sense of awe when I think about the power of water, and when I'm in nature, I'm the most able to savor beautiful moments and beautiful things. I love the colors and the sounds and the smells and everything about it. So for me, for right now, that's my church, is in nature. I feel a sense of wonder and awe there more than I ever did sitting in a Mormon church building. Um, I have I have rambled on for a very long time this evening. It was much longer than I expected it to be or wanted it to be. But I love being here with you beautiful human beings, and I hope that you've gotten something positive out of this episode. And if you have, please like the episode. Please share it with someone who needs to hear what you heard. And if you're able, please subscribe. And if you have the means, please become a member. I had a lovely, wonderful group coaching session this morning with some of the beautiful humans who come and visit my channel. It was a free session because group coaching is a new thing that I'm starting. I would love to have you join us for a free group coaching session. It was so wonderful to connect with other beautiful human beings and just talk about some of our experiences and talk about the way that we think about things and engage in the idea of just changing one small thing that can make our lives a little bit better. If you are so inclined, I also do one-on-one coaching, and you can go to my website, third-verse.com, and sign up for a free consultation where we meet one-on-one virtually and just see if we're a good fit to work together. One of the things that I love the most is connecting with other beautiful human beings and hearing your stories and finding ways that my experiences can help you to make your life better. I'm so grateful for the conversation that has happened here tonight, and I'm grateful for you for being here. Thank you for listening to me talk about my experience in journeying away from the Mormon Church. It has been very hard, and it will continue to be hard, but I am happier now than I ever have been. I am living a shame-free, meaningful life, and I think I'm probably doing more to help people now than I ever did when I was serving in the Mormon Church. Um, I have so much beauty in my life right now. And so if you're going through any kind of a faith transition or you're struggling with your faith, I want to reassure you that number one, it's 100% normal. It is totally normal for human beings to have faith crises. It happens all the time, every day. And I just want to encourage you that it gets better. It gets better, and you'll be happy again. You'll find peace again. And you have all of these beautiful humans to connect with this channel can be a resource for you, please reach out. I would love to plug you into other resources. And coming up over the next couple of weeks will be episodes with other beautiful human beings who have transitioned away from the Mormon Church and talking about their reconstruction, their faith journey now, what their lives look like now. And I'm so excited to share those stories with you. I hope that you will join us. Be good to each other, but most of all, be good to yourself. I love you guys. Have a great night.